For more than 2,000 years, Cleopatra has existed in two different worlds. In one world, she is one of the most famous women who ever lived. Her name appears in movies, novels, paintings, documentaries, and classrooms across the globe. In the other world, the world hidden beneath centuries of storytelling, she remains one of the least understood rulers in history. Many people recognize the legend. Far fewer know the woman. That difference may not be an accident. Because when historians trace the origins of Cleopatra's image, they encounter an uncomfortable reality. Much of what survives about her was written by people connected to Rome. The very civilization that spent years trying to defeat her. The very empire that benefited from transforming a dangerous opponent into something easier to explain. A seductress is less threatening than a strategist. A romantic figure is easier to dismiss than a political mastermind. And perhaps that is where the mystery truly begins. Not with Cleopatra herself, but with the story that survived after her death. Ancient Rome was not merely a military power. It was one of the greatest narrative machines in human history. Rome understood that conquering a nation was only half the battle. The other half was controlling how future generations remembered that conquest. Victory on the battlefield could fade. A successful narrative could last forever. And few victories were more important to Rome than Egypt. For centuries, Egypt had represented wealth, knowledge, prestige, and continuity. Long before Rome became an empire, Egypt was already ancient. Its monuments seemed eternal. Its rulers were surrounded by an aura of mystery and divine authority. To absorb Egypt into the Roman world was not simply a political achievement. It was a symbolic one. Yet standing between Rome and complete control was a woman. A woman who refused to behave the way history expected women to behave. Cleopatra did not inherit an easy kingdom. She was born into the Ptolemaic Dynasty, a Greek ruling family that had governed Egypt since the death of Alexander the Great. By the time Cleopatra came to power, her dynasty was weakened by internal conflict, economic pressure, political rivalries, and growing Roman influence. Many rulers in her position would have accepted decline as inevitable. Cleopatra chose a different path. What makes her story extraordinary is not that she faced impossible odds. History is filled with rulers who faced impossible odds. What makes her remarkable is how long she managed to resist them. At a time when entire kingdoms were collapsing under Roman expansion, Cleopatra kept Egypt independent for more than 2 decades. That achievement alone raises an important question. Was she truly the reckless, emotional figure described by many Roman accounts? Or was she something far more dangerous? The deeper researchers investigate her reign, the harder it becomes to ignore her competence. She managed diplomatic crises. She stabilized political alliances. She navigated some of the most volatile power struggles of the ancient world. She survived civil wars, palace intrigues, betrayals, and shifting loyalties. None of these are the accomplishments of a passive ruler. They are the accomplishments of someone who understood power at an exceptional level. Yet despite all of this, the public memory of Cleopatra became strangely narrow. Again and again, the focus returns to beauty, to romance, to scandal, to seduction. It is almost as if history became obsessed with everything except the qualities that allowed her to remain on the throne. And that is where the hidden side of this story begins to emerge. Because the closer we look, the more it appears that Cleopatra's greatest weapon was never her appearance. It was her understanding of people. It was her ability to read situations before others recognized the danger. It was her capacity to adapt while rivals remained trapped in old assumptions. Rome may have defeated Egypt. But defeating a nation and understanding its ruler are two very different things. If this investigation reveals anything, it is that the official version of Cleopatra's story may be incomplete. Behind the myth stands a woman whose influence extended far beyond romance, whose decisions altered the course of history, and whose true legacy may have been hidden beneath centuries of repetition. The question is not whether Cleopatra was powerful. The question is what kind of power she possessed. If you're fascinated by the hidden stories powerful empires tried to bury, subscribe now, Because Cleopatra's story is only the beginning, and some of the most surprising revelations are still ahead. And once we begin examining that question, the familiar story starts to look very different. The first surprise is that Cleopatra was not extraordinary because she was born into privilege. Ancient history is filled with privileged rulers who achieved very little. Her distinction came from what she chose to do with the position she inherited. Most members of the Ptolemaic dynasty lived at a distance from the people they ruled. Although they governed Egypt, they remained culturally Greek. Generations passed without fully embracing the language and traditions of the kingdom under their control. Cleopatra broke that pattern. Ancient sources suggest she became the first ruler of her dynasty to learn the Egyptian language fluently. At first glance, that detail may seem minor. In reality, it reveals something profound about how she understood leadership. Language is not simply communication. Language is access. It provides direct contact with emotions, beliefs, fears, ambitions, and loyalties. While other rulers depended on translators, Cleopatra could speak directly to different groups within her kingdom. She could listen without intermediaries. She could build trust without filters. And perhaps most importantly, she could understand perspectives that many members of her own dynasty ignored. Her intellectual reputation extended far beyond Egypt. Ancient writers describe a woman with an unusual fascination for learning. She studied politics, diplomacy, philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and economics. Some accounts suggest she spoke multiple languages, possibly as many as 7 or more. Historians debate the exact number, but the broader point remains significant. In an age when many rulers relied heavily on advisors for communication with foreign powers, Cleopatra often spoke directly with ambassadors and political figures herself. Imagine the advantage that creates. During negotiations, every translation introduces delay. Every intermediary introduces distortion. Cleopatra eliminated much of that barrier. While others waited for information to be interpreted, she was already observing reactions, identifying opportunities, and adjusting strategy in real time. This ability became one of her greatest strengths. Yet it also contributed to the misunderstanding that would follow her for centuries. Exceptional intelligence can be difficult to explain, particularly when it appears in someone whom society expects to underestimate. Throughout history, powerful women have often been described through the lens of personal influence rather than intellectual influence. Their success is attributed to relationships rather than strategy. Their achievements are framed as emotional rather than calculated. Cleopatra would become one of the most famous examples of this pattern. But the evidence increasingly suggests that she understood something many of her rivals failed to recognize. The future belonged to adaptation. The Mediterranean world was changing. Old political structures were collapsing. New centers of power were emerging. Rome was becoming stronger every year. Many leaders responded to this transformation by resisting it. Cleopatra chose to study it. She learned how power moved. She learned how influence spread. She learned how perception could become a weapon. And long before Rome reached its peak, she appears to have understood a reality that would define the rest of her reign. Egypt could not survive by relying on tradition alone. It needed a ruler capable of thinking differently. A ruler capable of operating simultaneously as a diplomat, strategist, negotiator, and symbol. In other words, it needed someone very different from the woman history would later reduce to a simple caricature. Because the deeper we look into Cleopatra's education, decisions, and leadership, the more another possibility emerges. Perhaps Rome's greatest challenge was never Egypt's wealth. Perhaps it was the woman who understood exactly how wealth, knowledge, image, and influence could be combined into a form of power that armies alone could not easily defeat. And that realization would soon place her on a collision course with the most ambitious republic the world had ever seen. The challenge facing Cleopatra was becoming impossible to ignore. Rome was no longer simply another powerful state competing for influence around the Mediterranean. It was transforming into something larger, something more dangerous. Each year brought new territories, new resources, new victories, and new ambitions. Kingdoms that had once seemed permanent were being absorbed one by one into an expanding sphere of Roman power. Many rulers still believed Rome could be confronted through traditional means. They believed the future would be decided by armies alone. Cleopatra appears to have reached a different conclusion. The evidence suggests she understood something that many of her contemporaries failed to recognize. Rome's greatest strength was not its soldiers. It was its ability to make other people accept Roman dominance as inevitable. This is where the story becomes far more interesting than the familiar tales of romance and intrigue. Because Cleopatra was not merely trying to protect Egypt from invasion. She was competing against an entire system of influence. A system capable of projecting authority across vast distances. A system capable of turning victories into myths and myths into political reality. To survive, she would need to play a different game. The battlefield would not exist solely on land or sea. It would exist in perception. In diplomacy. In symbols. In the minds of powerful people. Modern historians sometimes describe this as soft power. Cleopatra understood it more than 2,000 years before the term existed. Consider her position. Egypt remained one of the wealthiest regions in the ancient world. Its grain helped feed millions. Its ports connected major trade routes. Its treasury attracted allies and enemies alike. Yet wealth alone could not guarantee security. Wealth often attracts predators. The question was how to transform Egypt's resources into influence strong enough to delay Roman control. Cleopatra's answer was remarkably sophisticated. Instead of isolating Egypt from emerging power centers, she positioned herself near them. She cultivated relationships. She participated in political networks. She became impossible to ignore. This strategy would eventually bring her into contact with two of the most influential figures of the age. Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony. Popular culture often presents these encounters as romantic turning points. Reality was almost certainly more complicated. When Caesar arrived in Egypt, he was already one of the most experienced political operators in Roman history. He had survived military campaigns, rivalries, conspiracies, and decades of high-stakes competition. To imagine such a figure becoming powerless because of physical attraction alone oversimplifies both Caesar and Cleopatra. Something deeper was happening. What Caesar encountered was not merely a queen. He encountered a ruler capable of discussing politics, economics, military strategy, and statecraft at the highest level. He encountered someone who understood that alliances are built through value, not fantasy. Cleopatra knew how to make herself relevant to powerful people. Not by becoming smaller, but by becoming indispensable. This distinction matters because it reveals the hidden mechanism behind her influence. She did not persuade others to abandon their ambitions. She persuaded them that cooperation with her ambitions could advance their own. That is an entirely different skill. And it remains one of the most effective forms of leadership ever developed. Great influence rarely comes from forcing people toward your goals. It comes from aligning your goals with theirs. Cleopatra appears to have mastered this principle. Yet there was another layer to her strategy. One that is often overlooked. Ancient sources repeatedly mention her ability to communicate. Not merely her intelligence, but her presence. Several accounts suggest that her voice, conversation, and manner of speaking left a stronger impression than her physical appearance. This detail becomes more significant the closer we examine it. Throughout history, charisma has often been mistaken for beauty. They are not the same thing. Beauty attracts attention. Charisma holds attention. Beauty creates curiosity. Charisma creates loyalty. Beauty may open a door. Charisma determines what happens after entering the room. Cleopatra's reputation increasingly suggests she possessed the second quality at an extraordinary level. She adapted her communication to different audiences. She understood context. She recognized emotional dynamics. She knew when to appear regal and when to appear approachable. She knew when to project certainty and when to project flexibility. These are not the instincts of a passive ruler. They are the instincts of someone constantly studying human behavior. Someone who understood that influence begins long before decisions are made. Power is rarely exercised only through force. The most enduring forms of power shape perception itself. At this point, an important question begins to emerge. Do you think Rome feared Cleopatra herself, or the influence she represented? Let me know in the comments as we continue this investigation. They influence how people think before they realize they are being influenced. They create movements before battles begin. They alter outcomes before votes are cast. Cleopatra understood this world remarkably well. Yet even her considerable abilities could not change one reality. Rome continued growing stronger. The Republic was entering a period of transformation that would eventually reshape the ancient world. And as tensions increased, Cleopatra faced a decision that would define the next stage of her story. If Egypt could not defeat Rome from the outside, perhaps the only remaining option was to influence Rome from within. That possibility would set in motion a chain of events whose consequences would extend far beyond her lifetime. Because the closer Cleopatra moved toward the center of Roman power, the closer she came to discovering both its greatest strength and its greatest weakness. The more historians examine Cleopatra's reign, the clearer it becomes that she was operating on multiple levels simultaneously. While rivals focused on immediate victories, she often appeared to think in terms of long-term positioning. This difference in perspective helps explain why so many of her actions seem unusual when viewed through a purely military lens. She understood that symbols could outlive armies. Ideas could outlive rulers. Narratives could outlive empires. Ancient Egypt had practiced this principle for thousands of years. Its monuments were not merely structures. They were statements. Its rituals were not merely traditions. They were demonstrations of continuity. Its rulers understood that legitimacy depends as much on belief as on force. Cleopatra inherited that legacy and adapted it to a rapidly changing political environment. She recognized that Rome's rise was not simply a military phenomenon. It was also psychological. Roman leaders were constructing a story about themselves. A story of destiny. A story of expansion. A story of inevitable dominance. Such stories become powerful because people begin acting as though they are true. Allies submit before battles occur. Rivals lose confidence before conflicts begin. Entire populations adjust expectations around an emerging narrative. Cleopatra saw this process unfolding in real time. Rather than ignoring it, she engaged with it. And in doing so, she may have become one of the first leaders in history to wage a sophisticated battle over perception itself. The consequences of that decision would soon become impossible to separate from the fate of Egypt. And as Rome's internal struggles intensified, Cleopatra would find herself positioned closer than ever to the center of events that would change the ancient world forever. By the time Cleopatra entered the orbit of Rome's most powerful figures, the Republic was beginning to fracture under the weight of its own success. Victories had brought unimaginable wealth, but they had also created rivalries unlike anything Rome had faced before. Ambitious generals commanded loyal armies. Political alliances shifted constantly. Old institutions struggled to maintain control over a system that was growing faster than anyone had anticipated. To many observers, Rome looked invincible. Beneath the surface, however, cracks were already beginning to appear. Cleopatra understood that instability creates opportunity. This does not mean she caused Rome's internal conflicts. It means she recognized them. While others saw a unified empire in the making, she saw competing factions, competing ambitions, and competing visions for the future. Such moments are dangerous, but they also create openings for skilled political actors. This is one reason why reducing Cleopatra's story to romance misses something essential. Relationships were not the objective. Influence was. Access was. Information was. Survival was. Every ruler in the ancient world depended on alliances. Cleopatra simply happened to form hers at the center of history's most important political transformation. What made her remarkable was not that she participated in this struggle. It was that she remained relevant throughout it. Consider how difficult that should have been. Egypt was not directing events in Rome. Rome was directing events around the Mediterranean. The balance of power was increasingly obvious. Yet Cleopatra repeatedly found ways to remain part of conversations that would determine the future of entire civilizations. This required far more than charm. It required timing, judgment, adaptability. It required understanding which opportunities were genuine and which were traps. One mistake could destroy a kingdom. One miscalculation could end a dynasty. The pressure must have been immense. Yet the surviving record suggests a ruler who rarely stopped calculating. A ruler constantly evaluating risks and advantages. A ruler who understood that perception often determines reality before reality catches up. This may explain one of the most fascinating aspects of her legacy. Cleopatra seems to have understood the value of image long before image became a formal political tool. Modern leaders invest enormous resources into branding. They carefully manage public appearances, visual symbols, messaging, and reputation. Ancient rulers were not so different. The difference is that Cleopatra appears to have approached image as a strategic asset rather than a decorative one. She understood that symbols communicate power faster than speeches. A single image can shape assumptions before facts are examined. A carefully crafted appearance can reinforce authority without a word being spoken. Egypt had refined this concept for thousands of years. Pharaohs were not simply political leaders. They were embodiments of legitimacy. Their authority was reinforced through architecture, ritual, clothing, iconography, and public ceremony. Cleopatra inherited this tradition and adapted it to an increasingly interconnected world. Yet here we encounter another paradox. The very skills that helped her maintain influence may have contributed to the myths that followed her death. Because when later writers attempted to explain her success, many focused on visible effects rather than invisible causes. They saw outcomes but overlooked mechanisms. They saw influence but ignored intelligence. They saw loyalty but ignored strategy. The result was a simplified narrative that survived for centuries. A narrative that framed power as attraction rather than competence. And perhaps nowhere is this more apparent than in the stories surrounding Mark Antony. Their partnership remains one of history's most discussed relationships. Yet even here, the deeper question is often ignored. Why would one of Rome's most experienced military leaders continue investing political capital in Egypt if there were no strategic advantages involved? The answer is obvious. There were advantages. Egypt provided resources, stability, wealth, and geopolitical positioning. Cleopatra provided insight into a region Rome could not afford to ignore. Their alliance was political before it was personal. It was practical before it was romantic. That reality does not make the story less interesting. It makes it far more interesting. Because it reveals two ambitious individuals navigating an increasingly dangerous world. A world in which every alliance carried consequences. A world in which every public decision generated private enemies. A world moving steadily toward confrontation. As tensions escalated between Antony and Octavian, Cleopatra's position became even more precarious. The future of Egypt was becoming tied to events she could influence but not fully control. The room for error was shrinking. The stakes were rising. And somewhere in the background, another battle was already beginning. Not a battle of armies. A battle of stories. Octavian understood something crucial. If he defeated Antony, he would also need to define how future generations understood that victory. Narratives were already forming. Accusations were already spreading. Propaganda was already circulating. Rome was preparing not only for war, but for memory. And in that coming struggle over history itself, Cleopatra would become both a political opponent and a symbol. The consequences would echo for more than 2,000 years. Yet even as political tensions intensified, another side of Cleopatra was emerging. A side that modern audiences rarely encounter. Behind the diplomatic negotiations, public ceremonies, and strategic alliances stood a woman deeply interested in knowledge. Ancient accounts repeatedly connect Cleopatra to subjects that extended far beyond governance. Medicine, botany, chemistry, astronomy, natural philosophy. The boundaries between these disciplines were different in the ancient world, but the pattern remains striking. She appears to have been fascinated by understanding how things worked. This curiosity becomes particularly important when we examine some of the more unusual stories associated with her reign. Many later accounts describe experiments involving plants, compounds, perfumes, and medicinal preparations. Some stories may have been exaggerated over time. Others remain difficult to verify. But taken together, they point toward an image rarely discussed in popular culture. Not Cleopatra the seductress. Not Cleopatra the romantic heroine. Cleopatra the investigator. Cleopatra the experimenter. Cleopatra the ruler who treated knowledge itself as a source of power. This perspective changes everything. Because if knowledge was power, then Alexandria represented one of the greatest concentrations of power on earth. The city housed scholars, libraries, mathematicians, physicians, engineers, and philosophers whose work attracted visitors from across the ancient world. While Rome excelled at expansion, Alexandria excelled at learning. Cleopatra stood at the intersection of both traditions. She understood ideas. She understood symbols. She understood politics. And increasingly, she understood that the future of Egypt would depend on more than military strength alone. But as the conflict between Antony and Octavian moved toward its final phase, even her extraordinary abilities would face a challenge unlike any she had encountered before. The decisions she made next would become some of the most debated decisions in ancient history. And they would eventually lead to one of the most famous endings ever recorded. Or perhaps, one of the most misunderstood. History often presents turning points as sudden moments. A battle is fought. A ruler falls. An empire rises. Reality is usually far more complicated. Long before Egypt faced its final confrontation with Rome, the outcome was already being shaped by forces that could not be measured on a battlefield. Economics. Perception. Loyalty. Fear. Ambition. These invisible forces are often more powerful than armies because they determine how armies are used in the first place. Cleopatra understood this. Yet understanding a danger and stopping it are two very different things. By the final years of her reign, the balance of power was shifting rapidly. Octavian was becoming stronger. His position inside Rome was consolidating. Supporters gathered around him not only because of military victories, but because he represented stability after decades of chaos. This is an important detail because leaders rarely rise through strength alone. They rise because people become exhausted by uncertainty. Octavian offered order, predictability, a vision of the future. Whether that vision was entirely genuine mattered less than the fact that millions were willing to believe it. Cleopatra found herself confronting a challenge that has appeared throughout history. How do you oppose a rival who is becoming a symbol? Symbols are difficult to defeat because they exist in the imagination as much as in reality. By this stage, Egypt was not simply fighting Rome. It was fighting momentum. And momentum can be one of the most powerful forces in politics. Yet even in this increasingly dangerous environment, Cleopatra continued searching for solutions. One of the most persistent myths surrounding her portrays a ruler driven primarily by emotion. The historical record suggests something else. A ruler constantly evaluating possibilities. A ruler exploring alternatives. A ruler unwilling to surrender while options remained available. This determination becomes particularly visible when examining the final period of her reign. Contrary to popular imagination, Cleopatra did not appear to view defeat as inevitable until very late in the conflict. She continued negotiating, continued planning, continued attempting to preserve Egypt's autonomy. Some historians believe she explored multiple diplomatic paths simultaneously, hoping that changing circumstances might create opportunities. Whether these efforts could ever have succeeded remains impossible to know. What matters is that they reveal a leader still thinking strategically even as pressure mounted. This brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of Cleopatra's story: the hidden difference between power and control. Many people assume powerful individuals control events. History suggests otherwise. Even extraordinary leaders operate within constraints. They inherit circumstances they did not create. They face rivals they cannot fully predict. They encounter crises beyond their influence. The true measure of leadership often lies not in controlling outcomes, but in responding to changing conditions more effectively than others. Cleopatra excelled at this for most of her life. Yet by the final years of her reign, the variables multiplying around her were becoming almost impossible to manage. Rome's resources were immense. Internal alliances were shifting. Military realities were changing. The margin for error was disappearing. And still, perhaps the most fascinating battle remained unseen. While military preparations continued, a parallel campaign was unfolding inside the minds of Roman citizens. Octavian's supporters increasingly framed the conflict in specific terms. Not as a Roman civil war. Not as a struggle between rival factions. But as a confrontation between Rome and a foreign queen. This distinction was crucial. Civil wars are complicated. They divide loyalties. They raise uncomfortable questions. External enemies simplify everything. They create unity. They provide focus. They transform political opponents into threats. In many ways, Cleopatra became the perfect symbol for this strategy. Foreign. Powerful. Influential. Difficult to control. By presenting her as the central danger, Octavian's camp could redirect attention away from Rome's internal divisions. The effectiveness of this approach cannot be overstated. Narratives shape reality. People fight differently when they believe they are defending their civilization rather than participating in a political dispute. And so, long before the final confrontation occurred, the foundations of Cleopatra's future reputation were already being constructed. The image of the dangerous queen. The manipulative outsider. The woman responsible for Rome's troubles. It was brilliant propaganda. And perhaps that is why it survived so successfully. Yet the closer we examine the evidence, the more another possibility emerges. What if Cleopatra's greatest threat was never military? What if her greatest threat was symbolic? What if Rome feared not simply what she could do, but what she represented? Because symbols can inspire resistance. Symbols can unite rivals. Symbols can challenge narratives. And for a rising empire seeking legitimacy, competing symbols are dangerous. The battle was becoming larger than Egypt. Larger than Antony. Larger even than Cleopatra herself. It was becoming a battle over the story of the future. Who would define it? Who would inherit it? And who would be remembered once the dust settled? As the conflict approached its conclusion, another mystery begins to appear. One that continues to fascinate historians, archaeologists, and researchers today. The mystery of Cleopatra's final intentions. Popular accounts often portray her last days as an emotional collapse. Yet this interpretation raises serious questions. It conflicts with much of what we know about her character. Throughout her life, Cleopatra demonstrated calculation under pressure. Strategic thinking during crises. Adaptability in uncertain circumstances. Why would those qualities suddenly disappear at the moment they were needed most? Some researchers argue they did not. They suggest that even during the final chapter of her reign, Cleopatra remained focused on legacy. This idea becomes increasingly compelling when we consider a simple reality. By that stage, preserving Egypt's independence may no longer have been possible. Preserving her narrative was. Those are not the same objective. One concerns territory. The other concerns memory. And memory can outlast empires. Ancient rulers understood this deeply. Monuments existed for that reason. Rituals existed for that reason. Symbols existed for that reason. The struggle to influence how future generations remember the past is almost as old as civilization itself. Cleopatra, perhaps more than most rulers, understood the value of symbolic victories. Which raises a remarkable possibility. What if her final actions were designed not merely for the people around her, but for the people who would come centuries later? What if she understood that Rome might conquer Egypt, yet still fail to fully control her story? The answer to that question leads directly toward one of the most famous mysteries in history. The death of Cleopatra. A story told countless times. A story accepted by millions. And a story that becomes increasingly complicated the closer we examine it. Few stories in history have survived with such extraordinary confidence despite containing so many unanswered questions. Ask almost anyone how Cleopatra died, and the answer arrives immediately. A snake. A bite. A tragic ending. The image is so deeply embedded in popular culture that it feels unquestionable. Yet the moment researchers begin examining the details, certainty starts to disappear. The famous story becomes surprisingly fragile. Ancient sources themselves disagree on important aspects of the event. Some mention a snake. Others suggest poison. Some provide details that contradict one another. Others remain frustratingly vague. This uncertainty is not unusual in ancient history. What is unusual is how confidently later generations embraced a version that leaves so many questions unresolved. Consider the practical challenges alone. The Egyptian cobra most commonly associated with the story is not a small creature. It can grow several feet long and is hardly the sort of animal that quietly disappears into a room unnoticed. Then there is the issue of physical evidence. Ancient descriptions of venomous deaths do not always align with the calm and composed image associated with Cleopatra's final moments. Modern experts continue debating whether such a death would have unfolded in the manner traditionally described. None of this proves the story is false. It simply demonstrates that the matter is far less settled than many people assume. And that is where the mystery becomes genuinely fascinating. Because the question may not be whether a snake was present. The question may be why the story became so important. To understand that possibility, we must step back and consider the symbolic world Cleopatra inhabited. Modern audiences often separate politics, religion, and symbolism into different categories. Ancient civilizations rarely did. Symbols carried enormous power. They communicated legitimacy, authority, identity, and meaning. In Egypt, few symbols were more significant than the cobra. The sacred uraeus appeared on royal crowns for centuries. It represented divine protection, sovereignty, and the authority of the pharaoh. To Egyptians, the cobra was not merely an animal. It was an emblem of kingship itself. This detail changes the conversation entirely. Because if Cleopatra understood symbolism as well as the evidence suggests, then every aspect of her final image would have mattered. Her appearance. Her surroundings. The message left behind. The narrative future generations would inherit. By this stage in her life, she had spent decades navigating a world where perception influenced reality. She understood how stories spread. She understood how symbols endure. She understood how meaning can survive even when power does not. This leads to a possibility that historians continue to explore. Perhaps the most important question is not how Cleopatra died. Perhaps the most important question is how she wanted to be remembered. Those are very different questions. One concerns biology. The other concerns legacy. And legacy may have been the only battlefield she still controlled. Imagine this situation from her perspective. Rome was closing in. Octavian wanted more than victory. He wanted spectacle. He wanted a living symbol of Roman supremacy. A captive queen displayed before cheering crowds would have served that purpose perfectly. Yet that outcome never happened. Whether through poison, venom, or another method entirely, Cleopatra denied Rome the image it desired most. This fact alone deserves more attention than it usually receives. Even in defeat, she retained agency over the final chapter of her story. Even in defeat, she prevented her enemies from achieving their most symbolic triumph. There is something profoundly revealing about that. Throughout her reign, Cleopatra repeatedly demonstrated an awareness of optics, perception, and narrative. Why assume those instincts disappeared at the very end? Why assume the ruler who spent years navigating political complexity suddenly stopped thinking strategically? Increasingly, researchers are reconsidering this assumption. Some suggest that her final decisions may have been carefully calculated. Not because she expected to win, but because she understood that memory itself could become a form of victory. And if that interpretation is correct, then Cleopatra's final act may have been remarkably consistent with everything we know about her life. A ruler thinking beyond immediate circumstances. A ruler focused not only on present realities but future perceptions. A ruler determined to shape the story that would survive her. Ironically, that strategy may have worked better than anyone imagined. More than 2,000 years later, people continue debating her final hours. They continue discussing her choices. They continue questioning official accounts. In other words, her story remains alive. The conversation continues. The mystery endures. Few defeated rulers achieve that. Yet the mystery of Cleopatra's death is only one part of a larger puzzle. Because while historians debate the final scene, another question receives far less attention. What happened after her death? Not to her body. Not to her tomb. To her influence. Because something extraordinary seems to have occurred in the decades that followed. Egypt lost political independence. Yet elements of Egyptian culture continued spreading throughout the Roman world. Egyptian symbols appeared in Roman cities. Egyptian religious traditions attracted followers. Egyptian ideas found new audiences far from the Nile. At first glance, these developments may seem unrelated. Look closer and a different pattern begins to emerge. The civilization Rome conquered did not simply disappear. Parts of it were absorbed, adapted, reinterpreted. In some cases, admired. This raises a fascinating possibility. What if Cleopatra lost a kingdom but helped preserve something larger? What if her most enduring victory was not political at all? The answer begins with understanding how cultures survive. Empires rise and fall. Borders change. Governments collapse. Yet ideas can travel across centuries. Symbols can cross oceans. Beliefs can outlive the societies that created them. Egypt had already demonstrated this for millennia. Its influence stretched far beyond its territory. Its reputation extended far beyond its military power. And even under Roman rule, that influence did not vanish. If anything, it evolved. Which brings us to one of the most surprising chapters in this entire story. The possibility that Rome, despite defeating Cleopatra, ultimately absorbed more of her world than it was ever willing to admit. And if that is true, then the question of who truly won becomes far more complicated than history textbooks usually suggest. The idea that Rome may have absorbed elements of Egyptian influence is not as controversial as it first appears. In fact, it is one of the recurring patterns of history. Conquerors often inherit more from the conquered than they initially realize. Military victory establishes control over territory. Cultural influence operates according to different rules. It moves through admiration, imitation, adaptation, and gradual integration. Long after armies disappear, ideas continue traveling. Egypt had been exporting ideas for centuries before Cleopatra was born. Its architecture inspired awe. Its religious traditions fascinated outsiders. Its knowledge attracted scholars from across the ancient world. Alexandria itself had become one of the most important intellectual centers on earth. Physicians, mathematicians, astronomers, philosophers, engineers, and writers gathered there in numbers that few cities could match. Rome possessed extraordinary military and administrative power. Alexandria possessed something equally valuable: Prestige. Knowledge. Cultural gravity. When the Roman elite encountered Egypt, they did not simply encounter another province. They encountered a civilization already ancient by their own standards. This distinction matters because civilizations often borrow from what they respect. And Rome respected Egypt, even when Roman leaders publicly condemned aspects of it. The evidence appears in unexpected places. Egyptian obelisks began appearing throughout Rome. Religious practices associated with Egyptian deities spread across the empire. Temples dedicated to Isis attracted followers far beyond the Nile. Art, symbolism, architecture, and ceremonial traditions increasingly reflected a blending of influences. None of this means Cleopatra personally orchestrated these developments after her death. What it does suggest is that the world she represented proved far more resilient than political defeat alone would predict. This becomes particularly interesting when examining how power itself evolved within Rome. During the Republic, Roman leaders theoretically served the state. Authority remained distributed through institutions, assemblies, and competing offices. Yet over time, a different model emerged. Power became increasingly concentrated around individual rulers. Public imagery became more important. Ceremonial displays became more elaborate. Political legitimacy became increasingly connected to symbolism and personal authority. Historians debate the precise causes behind these changes, but one observation remains difficult to ignore. The Rome that emerged after Cleopatra looked different from the Rome that confronted her. Octavian would eventually become Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Officially, republican structures survived. In practice, a new system had emerged. One centered around a single dominant figure whose image, authority, and public perception became central to governance. This transformation did not happen because of Cleopatra. It happened because Rome was already evolving. Yet there is an irony here that historians continue to note. The civilization that portrayed Egypt as backward increasingly adopted methods that resembled forms of authority Egypt had practiced for centuries. Symbolism. Ritual. Public image. Monumental architecture. Carefully managed legitimacy. These were hardly new concepts along the Nile. Which brings us back to the hidden theme running through this entire story. Power is rarely what it appears to be. Most people recognize armies because armies are visible. Most people recognize battles because battles are dramatic. Far fewer recognize the influence of ideas because ideas operate quietly. They move beneath the surface. They spread gradually. By the time their effects become obvious, they have often been shaping events for generations. Cleopatra seems to have understood this reality exceptionally well. Again and again, her story returns to the relationship between visible power and invisible power. Military strength versus influence. Territory versus perception. Force versus legitimacy. These tensions defined her world. They continue defining ours. Yet there is another mystery surrounding Cleopatra that remains unresolved. Perhaps the most famous unsolved question of all. Her tomb. Despite centuries of searching, no confirmed burial site has ever been discovered. Few historical figures have generated such persistent fascination among archaeologists. The reasons are obvious. Finding Cleopatra's tomb would not simply reveal information about a famous queen. It could answer questions that have remained open for 2,000 years. Questions about her appearance, her health, her final days, her burial rituals, her family, her world. For generations, historians assumed the tomb was lost forever beneath modern Alexandria, damaged by earthquakes, rising waters, and centuries of urban development. Yet in recent decades, new discoveries have reopened the conversation. Archaeologists working near the ancient temple complex of Taposiris Magna have uncovered evidence that some researchers believe may be connected to Cleopatra's final resting place. The investigations remain ongoing. No definitive conclusion has been reached. But the possibility itself has reignited global interest. What makes these discoveries so compelling is not simply the chance of finding a tomb. It is the possibility of confronting reality. For centuries, Cleopatra has existed somewhere between history and mythology. Each generation has projected its own assumptions onto her story. Some imagined a romantic heroine. Others imagined a ruthless schemer. Others imagined a tragic victim. The archaeological record has the potential to challenge all of those narratives. Physical evidence does not care about legends. It does not care about propaganda. It does not care about movies or popular assumptions. It simply exists. And if one day Cleopatra's tomb is discovered, historians may be forced to reconsider everything once again. Perhaps she will appear remarkably different from the figure preserved in public imagination. Perhaps she will confirm some theories while destroying others. Perhaps the greatest surprise will be discovering how much remains unknown. Whatever the outcome, one fact seems increasingly clear. The real Cleopatra was almost certainly more complex than either her admirers or her critics preferred to believe. If someone you know loves ancient history, forgotten queens, or historical mysteries, consider sharing this documentary with them. Complexity, however, is rarely what survives. Myths survive. Symbols survive. Stories survive. And few stories have survived more successfully than hers. Yet before we decide what Cleopatra's legacy truly means, we must confront one final question. Not whether she was beautiful. Not whether she was brilliant. Not whether she was ambitious. But whether she ultimately failed. Because that answer may depend entirely on how we define victory. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join us for the next chapter. Cleopatra was not the only woman history tried to diminish, simplify, or erase. See you in the next video.